In the biting cold mist of early morning, a mother's heart nearly stopped when she discovered her young son missing from his bed. She rushed outside, bare feet pressing into the wet grass, her voice echoing across the yard in sheer panic. Then suddenly, she saw them two familiar figures from memory, Nova and Luna, the wild bobcats she had once rescued from a devastating forest fire years ago. In the protective circle they formed, Oliver, barely over a year old, sat quietly, smiling with serene safety, as if guarded by the gentle instincts of these once feral predators. In that moment, every boundary she had ever known between love and instinct dissolved completely, altering the course of her life forever. That early morning, the pale light of dawn filtered through the curtains, casting a cold gray hue across the room. The mother jolted awake with a strange instinct, her heart pounding in her chest, a sense of unease spreading through her entire body. She sprang from bed and rushed to Oliver's room, her son, just over a year old. The crib was there, the door still shut tight like every night before. But inside, empty. Oliver was gone. Her heart dropped into a pit of despair, her breath short and frantic as she scanned the room for any sign of him. No windows were open, no doors ajar. How could a toddler vanish when everything remained untouched? Terror gripped her like a vice, propelling her out into the garden, calling Oliver's name into the thick morning mist. The fog wrapped around the yard like a shroud, hiding everything from view, intensifying her rising panic. Barefoot, she ran across the damp lawn, the cold earth biting at her feet, but she no longer felt it. Then, through the blur of tears and desperation, she saw something impossible. Beneath the old wooden swing, two familiar shapes sat still. Nova and Luna, wild bobcats she had rescued years ago from a devastating forest fire, creatures she never expected to see again. And between them sat Oliver, perfectly calm, his eyes lit with innocent joy, entirely unafraid. Nova sat on the left, Luna on the right, their sleek bodies forming an invisible circle of protection around the child. The mother froze, her heart stopping for a beat as she took in the surreal sight. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. And then, something even more incredible happened. Nova slowly lowered her head and gently licked Oliver's cheek, an affectionate, tender gesture that made the boy burst into pure, delighted laughter, as if he were in the arms of someone who loved him deeply. That moment shook the mother to her core. The instincts of a predator had transformed into something soft, protective. Nova and Luna showed no aggression, no threat, just quiet presence, like two silent guardians watching over a child who somehow belonged to them. In that moment, the mother realized everything she thought she knew about wildness, about instinct, even about love had changed forever. Amid the freezing mist, as her breath steadied and her tears slowed, she knew now that Oliver had never truly been lost. He had been found safe, protected by something wondrous and far beyond her understanding. The memory of Nova and Luna remained vivid in the mother's mind, like a lingering ray of warmth from the dark days of the great forest fire. Back then, she had found them when the woods were nothing but ashes, and smoked two frail bobcat kittens huddled together, trembling, their wide eyes full of terror and hopelessness. She brought them home, nurturing them with all the patience and love she could offer those tiny, broken creatures. Day by day, Nova and Luna grew stronger, healthier, more resilient. But they never became pets. Though they allowed her closeness, their wild nature always maintained a certain distance, a silent reminder that they belonged not to people, but to the deep forests and towering mountains. Then, one day, just as the mother discovered she was pregnant with Oliver, Nova and Luna vanished. No sound, no trace. It was as if their presence had been a chapter with a closing page, a mission fulfilled, and time to return to where they truly belonged. In the years that followed, she often wondered about them, where they were, how they survived, and why they left at such a pivotal moment in her life. But now, their sudden return on that fog-shrouded morning felt anything but random. They hadn't come back as wanderers seeking shelter. They had come back as guardianship, deliberate and precisely in the exact moment her son faced unseen danger. Their eyes held none of the fear or confusion they once carried. Instead, they radiated clarity and calm, anchored, powerful, almost sacred. They did not flinch at her panic, nor respond to her fear. They simply did what they had come to do: protect Oliver, no matter what. From that moment, she understood their return was not by chance. It was a calling, an unseen purpose neither she nor any human could fully grasp. For the threats facing Oliver were not things she could see or sense, but Nova and Luna could. They could detect danger buried deep in shadow, threats that moved with no sound and left no trace. Their reappearance was a silent but resolute declaration. Oliver was not alone. There was a connection between the boy and these wild creatures, something beyond logic, beyond language. An invisible thread, stronger than fear, had pulled them back not as former rescues, but as chosen protectors. They returned not only to shield Oliver from harm, but also to teach her something profound about love, about loyalty, and about the unseen forces that bind us to the wonders of this world. Nova and Luna were no longer just part of her past. They were part of her son's destiny. At first, the appearance of Nova and Luna filled the mother with fear and unease. Every evening she checked the locks twice, shut every window tightly, and constantly monitored the security cameras, haunted by an unspoken dread. But as the days passed, something began to shift. The two Bobcats moved silently, never approaching too closely, yet always present, doing strange and quiet things that gradually dissolved her fear into curiosity and cautious wonder. On early mornings, Grace often found peculiar little gifts on the front porch, tokens she knew could only have come from Nova and Luna. Sometimes it was a small pine cone, still damp with morning dew, lying just outside the door like a gentle greeting. Other times, it was the neatly placed tail of a squirrel, as if inviting Oliver to join in their untold forest adventures. And once, she found an abandoned bird's nest, set carefully near Oliver's crybin emblem of care, of shelter. These were not random gestures. Each gift was a silent message, deeply symbolic and full of meaning. They stirred something inside her, a strange feeling that Nova and Luna no longer saw Oliver as merely a human child, but had begun to accept him as part of their keen, tiny member of their wild and watchful tribe. Whenever the Bobcats appeared, they kept their respectful distance from Grassino, overly friendly, but close enough to sense Oliver's breath, his safety. On certain nights, Grace would wake suddenly, tiptoe to the window, and find them standing vigil outside Oliver's door, their golden eyes glowing softly in the dark like two loyal sentinels. These moments were brief, silent, yet carried a weight of understanding, something deeper than language, a kind of communication built on trust. Slowly, the mother's suspicions gave way to a fragile but unmistakable belief. Nova and Luna hadn't returned to harm or threaten Oliver. On the contrary, they had come to protect him, to teach him, in a way only the wilderness could. The small gifts were not merely offerings, but lessons, ways of expressing affection, loyalty, and the sacred responsibility of guardianship. Oliver, too, grew increasingly enchanted by their presence. Each morning, he would glance eagerly out the window, hoping for the next quiet miracle Nova and Luna might bring. And for the first time in many long months, Grace's heart felt at ease. Though her son was small and vulnerable, he was not alone. He was watched over by two wild Bobcats who had once survived a raging fire, who had once been saved by her hands, and who now, in their own wild and wordless way, were repaying that act of mercy with a devotion stronger than she had ever imagined. That afternoon, melted snow traced long, damp lines across the wooden floor, the freezing rain having just ended, leaving the forest air thick with a wet, earthy scent. Grace had just finished stacking a crate of dry hay in the shed when she froze at the sound of the screen door slamming shut. "Oliver?" she called, but only silence answered. Her heart tightened. Oliver was always well-behaved. He never wandered far. But ever since Nova and Luna had returned, he had grown more curious, often slipping away quietly, following the soundless steps of the two Bobcats. Grace ran around the cabin, calling his name along the slope. No giggles, no tiny footprints on the soaked ground. just silence heavy and dense like a blanket of snow. When she stepped back inside, the kitchen door was ajar. A chill slid through the room, and then she saw it. Oliver was sitting on the wooden floor, cheeks smudged with dirt. His wide eyes filled not with fear but wonder. To his left was Nova, body curled, back low, eyes locked on a single point beneath the cupboard. Luna stood opposite, ears high, whiskers twitching. Between them lay the severed body of a black snake, its head still twitching slightly, its bloodied tongue flicking the air. Grace stood frozen, her feet rooted in place. Not a growl, not a scratch on Oliver. Nova slowly broke eye contact with the snake and approached her, no growl, no lowered head like a creature caught in guilt. It looked at her with the gaze of something that had made a choice, that this place was its domain now, and that the child, this boy, was something it would protect, no matter the cost. Grace dropped to her knees and pulled Oliver close. The boy whispered, "I wasn't scared. Nova and Luna wouldn't let me move. They've been sitting like that since I started drawing." She looked around the scattered sketch paper, half-finished lines. The snake must have slithered in through a crack, silent as night. And the two bobcats, rather than flee, had stayed, guarding, like two silent sentinels. Grace no longer saw them as wild animals, no longer as rescues meant to return to the woods, no longer they or it, but Nova and Luna, souls capable of affection, of love on their own wild terms. That night, as wind howled through the cracks in the cabin and firelight danced across the old wooden walls, Grace laid out an extra blanket in the corner of the room. Without a word, Nova curled up there, and Luna positioned herself at the door. Oliver slept peacefully, still clutching a drawing unfinished in his small hand. 3 figures side by side, a small boy and 2 large cats with upright ears. Like a family, unspoken, but undeniable. For years, the forest behind the house had remained quiet, like a separate world where the wind was the only voice. But in recent weeks, that calm had shifted. Ever since the venomous snake incident, Grace began to notice small changes, subtle but unsettling, the kind only someone who had lived long in the wild would detect. One morning, as the sun swept across the grass, she found the wooden fence behind the chicken coop torn with deep, sharp claw marks, not from a bobcat, but something larger, heavier. 2 nights later, Nova woke her not with a cry, but a firm, cold nudge. When Grace stepped outside, she saw Luna standing still at the forest's edge, her eyes locked on a darkness too deep to decipher. Grace followed her gaze. At first, just shadows. Then something moved. Tall, silent, not shaped like a bear or a fox. It looked like a creature stitched together from many beast legs, long like a wolf's, fur mottled and patchy, its head lowered in an unnatural slant. Grace couldn't be sure of what she saw, but Nova was certain. From that night on, neither bobcat slept inside. They took turns guarding the cabin, circling it in silence. The ground outside the porch was now dotted with tracks, not Oliver's, not Grace's. Large, heavy prints layered over one another, as if a group of something had passed through. Wolves? Maybe. But deep inside, Grace felt something different. Something was coming for Oliver. One night, wind shrieked through the rooftop. The lights flickered, then died. Grace grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the porch. Nova and Luna were there, staring into the dark, their eyes glowing gold like twin flames. Then came the sound, not a growl, but a horrible creaking, like ropes stretched to their limit, like bones snapping. Oliver screamed. Grace ran to his room, scooping him up. Nova darted ahead, positioning herself between Grace and the door. Outside, heavy footsteps pounded around the cabin. Nothing broke in, no windows shattered, but the walls shivered, and the air smelled of scorched fur, as if something once burned had returned from the ashes. Nova and Luna growled low and constant. Oliver stopped crying. Then, silence. At dawn, Grace stepped outside. The ground was littered with strange tracks, some fading into nothing, as if the creature had simply vanished. On the roof, she found a clump of dark, fur-bloodied, but belonging to no animal she recognized. From that day on, Grace no longer slept at night. She placed a chair by the fire, kept the lights burning. Nova rested at the front door. Luna curled on the back porch. They didn't speak. They didn't need to name what stalked them. But they knew. Something was testing the boundary between wildness and love. And Nova and Luna, these creatures of the forest, had chosen to fight not for territory, but for a child, for something more sacred than instinct. The snowstorm raged for 3 days and 3 nights, burying the Okanogan forest in a blinding white silence that felt more like death than stillness. Inside the cabin, the air was thick, frozen not by the cold, but by the growing fear that clung to every breath. Oliver suddenly spiked a high fever. He lay limp and flushed, his little face burning, sweat soaking through his clothes. Grace, her hands trembling, pressed cold cloths to his skin and called his name again and again. He didn't respond. The clinic, over 30 miles from the forest, told her he had to be hospitalized immediately. Wrapping him in blankets, she ran out into the storm, snow lashing her face as she drove through white oblivion. The whole way, she looked back in the mirror, again and again, half expecting to see Nova and Luna watching from the tree line. But they didn't come. They stayed behind with the woods, with the cabin, with whatever darkness had been lurking there. Oliver was admitted in a dazed, feverish state. All tests came back normal. No infection, no explanation, just a mystery that deepened with every passing hour. On the second night, Grace sat alone by the hospital window, tears dropping silently into a crumpled handkerchief. Then, a sound soft, like claws brushing against glass. She looked up. Nova. The Bobcat stood just outside the first-floor window, her coat soaked in snow, her eyes glowing not from the hospital lights, but from something far older, far deeper. In her mouth was a bundledry grass tied with a vine. Grace, confused and trembling, stepped outside. A nurse at the desk barely caught a glimpse of the animal before it vanished into the woods behind the hospital. In Grace's hands, the bundle was still warm. And inside not just grass, but a sleek black feather, a tiny white pebble, and a sliver of bark with claw marks etched into it. No one could explain it. But the very next morning, Oliver opened his eyes. "Where's Nova?" he whispered. Grace could only stare, speechless. Days later, the doctors confirmed his fever had vanished completely. No medication, no lingering symptoms. It was as if he'd simply awakened from a deep, mystical sleep. While packing to leave, Grace found the same piece of claw-marked bark tucked beneath Oliver's pillow, though no one had seen it placed there. She asked no questions. No one had answers anyway. As the car turned onto the forest road leading home, Nova and Luna were already there, not waiting at the doorstep, not pacing anxiously, just standing still, silent, watching. Oliver rolled down the window and waved. "They're here, Mama. They waited for us." Grace didn't reply. Her eyes were filled with something quieter than words' acceptance, like fresh snow settling over old tracks. She understood now that every assumption she had once held about wild animals had shattered. Nova and Luna were not just creatures of the forest. They were something more, something sacred, the line between light and shadow, a force only those who had brushed against true loss could ever recognize. They were guardians, the final protectors, sent not by nature, but perhaps through it for Oliver. A few weeks after Oliver recovered, life seemed to slowly return to normal. But deep within Grace and her husband, Daniel, there lingered an unspoken weight, something they couldn't yet name. One early spring morning, as the snow finally melted from the last storm, Daniel went to rebuild a section of the backyard fence that had collapsed. As he dug a post hole, his shovel struck something hard and hollow, not stone, not root. Clearing away the dirt, he uncovered a long, weathered wooden slab, intricately carved by hand. On its surface were ancient patterns, two sharp-eared creatures flanking a sleeping infant. Grace stood over it silently for a long time. Daniel, a local history teacher, brought the artifact to a friend who was an ethnographer. Days later, the friend confirmed it was a piece of an old altar from a now-extinct tribe, known for their belief in child guardians, sacred protectors of children. According to legend, every child born on sacred land would be chosen by a pair of spirit beasts to become a watched one. These guardians weren't gods, nor mere animals, but souls that lived between two worlds, arriving when a child faced dangers beyond human comprehension. Grace whispered, "Oliver was born in this house." And the night Nova and Luna reappeared, that was the same night she had nearly fallen on the porch during a sudden thunderstorm, 6 months pregnant. From that moment on, everything began to align. The claw marks, the strange gifts, the way Nova and Luna watched not like wild predators, but like keepers of a silent vow. That night, after revisiting the ancient records, Grace opened Oliver's bedroom window and softly called, "Nova? Luna?" No sound, no snapping twigs. But minutes later, from the stillness of the woods, two golden eyes appeared behind the trees. They didn't approach, just stood, watching. Oliver stirred in his sleep, eyes still closed, lips forming barely a whisper. "They're here." From then on, whenever Oliver felt scared or woke from a nightmare, he only had to say their names. And Nova, Luna would return not loudly, not demanding, but quietly lying there, like two stars guarding a tiny sky. Grace no longer sought explanations. Some things, like breath, like a mother's love, like the soul of a child, needed no words, only belief and gratitude. Nova and Luna were no fairy tale. They were part of this land, and Oliver, the chosen child, now had protectors who watched in silence, crossing the boundaries of species and even death itself. Early summer sunlight painted the edge of the wooden roof in gold as a gentle breeze stirred the ribbons hanging between the trees. It was Oliver's second birthday, a day without noise, without a grand celebration, just the scent of warm pastries, wildflowers picked by Grace, and the quiet smiles of those who knew this boy had been kept rescued from the hands of fate. Everyone stood on the porch, silently gazing out at the backyard. There, in the center of the soft green grass, Oliver sat with his tousled brown hair falling over his forehead, his tiny hand resting gently on Nova's back. Luna lay a short distance away, her eyes half closed, as if dreaming. No laughter, no calling. Only peace, a rare, pure kind of peace so sacred that no one dared disturb it. Grace squeezed Daniel's hand, feeling her heartbeat slow to the rhythm of the forest's breath. In that moment, Oliver was not a child playing with animals. And Nova and Luna were not wild creatures once rescued by humans. The scene of a 2-year-old boy sitting still between two fully grown bobcats felt like an ancient song that had never been written down. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't curious. He simply was. As if among the three of them, a bond had formed that transcended species, that defied any notion of ownership or domestication. At one point, Oliver leaned toward Nova and whispered something in her ear. He smiled, nodding as if sharing a precious secret. Nova tilted her head but said nothing, only stretched forward to gently touch her forehead to his. Luna, ever quiet, nudged a small wild blade of grass toward the boy, a humble gift, like all the others before. Oliver picked it up and carefully tucked it into his pocket. Moments later, he rested his head against Nova's back and closed his eyes. On the porch, no one spoke. Daniel wiped his eye discreetly. Grace smiled and whispered to herself, "We don't need the same language to love." And she understood. Love didn't need to be spoken, didn't need to be named, or written into a family registry. Nova and Luna were part of the living memory of Oliver's childhood. Not pets, not rescued animals, but family. A family born from the wilderness, silent, loyal, and asking for nothing. Beneath the open sky, surrounded by trees and morning light, three beings sat beside each other, not needing to understand through reason, only through trust, and a love without words, never once broken.